afternoon session here at Atlantic Dialogues. I hope you all had a good lunch. I trust you weren't on the bus that got lost, but if you were, nice to see Rabat. It's an interesting city. Before we get started, I just want to recognize a special guest that we have here today, Mr. Belghazi, whose Belghazi Musée is the source of many of the beautiful things that you see out in the lobby. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn the microphone over to one of our favorite moderators, Lisa Mullins. Lisa?
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here again. Hope you all had a wonderful lunch. By the way, I know a lot of people talk over lunchtime. Do you mind turning off your cell phones? If you haven't already, we'd really appreciate it. Foreseen, Cesar, a great video that German Marshall Fund has prepared for you.
The global energy system is changing at a dizzying pace. Recent years have seen the discovery of an abundance of new energy sources in the Atlantic Basin. Thanks to a revolution in unconventional oil and gas, the United States is close to overtaking Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil exporter and is on the way to becoming energy independent. Brazil and Nigeria are firmly established as producers of oil and gas of worldwide significance, with other countries from both South America and Africa quickly joining their ranks. What will the recent developments in energy technology and new discoveries of energy resources in the Atlantic Basin mean for the region's economic development, regional cooperation, and the global energy system? What new energy resource discoveries can we expect in the coming decades? And how can countries meet the energy needs of the global poor without losing sight of the need to address climate change?
I'm going to ask you to do something that's really heretical when you're in a beautiful place like Morocco. I'm going to ask you to forget that you're here and instead pretend that you are in a place far, far away from here in a time long, long ago. And I wonder if we can get the map up here of the world as we had before, if anybody can hear me. If not, just use your imagination. Instead of being on this end of the Atlantic, picture yourself on the other end. From here, I'll do the weather girl thing, from here all the way over to there, to the United States, the western half of the United States. Think of what's going on right now in terms of energy production, specifically in renewable energies, as something akin to the Wild West of the United States. Now, I think even those of you who are not from the United States might know about the Wild West and the iconography of that time, with cowboys and black hats and white hats and black horses and white horses, and you knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Right now, there's something akin to that going on in energy because it is such a brand new time with new frontiers and new claims, stakeholders and stakes to certain territory. And it's an exciting time, and that's where we're going to begin today. You play an enormous part of this, as do our guests here, who I'll introduce to you in just one second. But I wonder first if you could think about a word, whatever word comes to mind when you hear about renewable energy, about sustainable sources. Now, you've gotten probably pretty familiar so far with the AD Connect technology in front of you. So you all have your iPads there or your mobile devices. Look on the left-hand side. Go down to the part that says Tag Cloud. Under Tag Cloud, it's kind of free association. If you can write out the one word, and if you have to, it can be two words, but only two words at most, that immediately come to you when you hear the term renewable energy. You have about 15 seconds to do this. You can do it now. And you're all thinking, right? Okay, everybody done? Oh, slow writers. Depends on the age. I won't say there's a bit of a generational test going on here, but there is. Okay, you can keep writing if you want. But I'm going to hear the response of our panelists now as we look to the responses first that are here. Oh, we can see them taking shape. This is the great part of this technology. Caribbean. Is the Caribbean extraordinarily represented in this room? Compared to France, which I can barely read. Oh, farce. Is that... What else do we see over there? Somebody tell me. Green. Waves. Oh, there. Sustainability, water, thermal, sun, solar. The very light blue efficiency, which I think means like maybe one person saw it. Okay, now that's very interesting. Whoever submitted farce is going to be called on here, or I dare you to raise your hand at some point. Okay, so for our guests, first, why don't we start off to the left-hand side here. The Honorable Bas Eickhout is a European Member of Parliament who is based in Brussels, originally from the Netherlands. I know that you're a champion of renewables, a leading figure on this issue in the European Parliament. What was your word and why?
I think I would go for the word future.
Say it again?
Future.
Future.
Yeah. And
Really? You did that?
I did that. You did
Yeah.
the same?
Yeah.
We didn't agree on that beforehand.
Think quick, Lawrence. You can have a new one coming up.
But I think it's clear why future. I mean, if you look at, from a climate perspective, but also if you look at the people that they want to own their energy again and not, centralized production, but more decentralized, I do think then that renewables is the future.
In the future. Okay, good. Lawrence, future, yeah.
Well, for me, it would be...
Oh, I'm sorry, I should say who you are. This is Dr. Lawrence Jones. He is a vice president at ALSTOM, someone who's a proponent of human power and human resources in the creation of new technologies and innovation. Your word?
So my word would be paradigm shift.
2 words.
And I think it is because to really achieve what we're talking about regarding renewables, there has to be a mental shift in not just how we consume energy. There has to be a mental shift in how we go about setting in place policies to support renewables. The business models have to change, and our perception of the future has to also change. So I think paradigm shift has to be my word.
Okay, good, thank you. Much more on that later on. Senator Chris Murphy, a member of the U.S. Senate, representing the East Coast state of Connecticut, just south of my East Coast state of Massachusetts. You are a key figure in the country that's suddenly seeing itself in an entirely new position, more self-reliant in terms of energy development than it has been. What's the word that popped into your head?
Survival. I come from a coastal state. I was riding the bus back from lunch with a friend from Cape Verde. In my short time in the United States Senate, which is in the United States Congress, which has been about 6 years, what were initially the worst case estimates in terms of global temperature change and sea level rise are now the mainstream estimates. And as a young new United States Senator, as the father of 2 kids, if I want my nation and my state to survive and be around in the same form and shape that it is today for my kids, the only way that we combat those 2 trend lines on sea change and temperature change is investing in renewable energy.
As a point of survival. Okay, thank you. And also, on the far right here, Cesar Zamora of AEI Services and Energy Company. He is the country manager in Nicaragua. Your country has made enormous and impressive gains in wind power in particular. Can you tell us what word came to mind for you today?
Cost effective. I
2
think.
words again. Cost effective?
Yeah, 2 words, right?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, only 2.
I think energy is a long-term investment, and we have to invest in good resources that the earth has, but has to have the challenge of last long-term. So for me, it's important that the renewable energy has a resource that is good in the long term.
Okay. I didn't hear many of the words that our audience came up with repeated here, and so if any of you want to bring up your particular point of view from the Caribbean to farce at some point, then please do. I just want to mention first, though, that there's a report that many of you probably have seen on the AD Connect site that the German Marshall Fund put out, and this describes the new energy expansion as, and I'm going to paraphrase here, the tectonic plates of the global system continuing to shift and offering economic and geographic potential. Surprising new vectors are coming into view. It is that behind the crush of daily headlines, an Atlantic Basin energy system has been quietly coalescing. There's a boom in the supply of fossil fuels. This, in just the past 10 years, really what happened just in the past decade is amazing. There's a ring of hydrocarbons in the South Atlantic. There is a unconventional gas revolution taking place. At the same time, renewable energies from bioenergy to solar and wind power are emerging more quickly in the Atlantic region than anywhere else. Now, with all the realignment that's been going on as well, this is a key issue because, again, it's a bit like the Wild Wild West in that we have no idea where it's going. We have perhaps a lack of law or regulation or a misunderstanding of the future that's putting certain regulations into flux and into question. You have a role to play. You have just played a role. I'm going to ask you to play another one right now. If you would please look at the voting mechanism on AD Connect. This is where you cast your vote on, it's kind of a multiple choice question that you'll see listed here. And this has to do with what is going to make renewable sources of energies, sustainable energies, survive. So we'll see the question posed up here in just a second. But there are 9 choices. You'll have about a minute because it's a lot to go through. And if you can look and determine what you think it is that is needed, what is the essential ingredient? So, the most needed item for innovation in the energy sector to succeed. Hopefully you can read that. Cross-regional cooperation, public investment, private investment, education and training programs, so that gets back to that human capital that we were talking about. Number 5 is more government regulation and support. 6, less government regulation and interference, depending on your point of view. Acknowledgement of the need for change, that's number 7. Number 8, more successful technological advancement. And 9, innovation is overrated. So you have now just under a minute to enter your one top choice. You can all respond to this too if you like. Oh, wow. Now that's surprising. Well, at least I'm surprised. I don't know if you are. Number 7, 32%, about a third of the people here say acknowledgement of the need for change. Actually, could anyone who agrees with that strongly raise your hand and tell us why? And if we have, do we have microphones available yet? Yeah, okay. A couple people over here.
Why did I choose that option? I'm from Brazil.
Yes.
A few years ago, we had one of the most important programs as what regards renewable energy in Brazil. And because of short-term problems, I mean inflation, the government is not giving the support to the sugarcane industry that produces ethanol, and we are losing the field. Mm-hmm. I think this would be very different if our public opinion would have a different capacity of pressure to government.
Thank you. Okay, let's start off the discussion with you now, and I'd like you all to weigh in on this, because from your various perspectives, I wonder if you can tell us, and maybe we can start off with you, Cesar Zamora. Yeah. What is it, was that a major part of the ingredient that brought wind power, along with some traditional sources, to Nicaragua? Was there a public change of opinion, something that you had to help initiate, or others as well?
I think the need for...
And tell us the status right now of what's happening there.
For Central America is a region that lacks energy resources. There is no coal, there is no gas, there is no enough rain. Only half of the time rains in our area. The heights are not that high, so we have to be very sharp in finding what are the resources that the country has. And then we have to start a dialogue with politicians and government saying, what is the most effective way to generate electricity for our communities? We find a resource that is new in Nicaragua, that is wind. Wind was effectively possible because the price of oil went above $100 the barrel. And for that situation, we find a site in Nicaragua that produces 50% of the time of the year. That resource is extraordinary. For example, in Spain, you generate electricity with wind with 13% of the time.
What happens with the other 50%, though?
The other 50% you don't have the resources, but there is rain. In Nicaragua, when there is rain, you can have hydro capacity.
You have, say it again?
Rain.
Hydro capacity.
Yeah, we use hydro. Of the raining season, we use wind. So we complement energy. You have to be sharp to complement energy because renewable energy doesn't give you firm capacity, and that's the challenge for the countries. So we have to be very effective in dialogue, in a dialogue with authorities and with the society. At the end, we have to convince society that the cheapest energy is the one that can be produced by the local resources in the country. And that's the challenge.
Bess, what's the challenge for you in the European Parliament? Who are the parties who need convincing?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the powers at play, and there are a lot of vested interests, and I think Brazil is a good example there, where you see that, Brazil is one of the countries with the highest rate of renewables, but at the same time what you see now, when oil is being found along the coast, you see that the easiest option is to go for that. So that's probably also why Lawrence was talking about a kind of a paradigm shift, is that what you see is that turning into renewables is not only another technology, but it's also far more decentralized. It's less into the hands of the multinationals. So there is a change there of possession as well. And I think that struggle for power is also very visible in Europe. There is now a policy that is promoting renewable energy until 2020, but what you see happening now is there's a debate on what to do beyond 2020, because for investors, 2020 is tomorrow. And what you see, and now there's a fight, should we need another renewable target beyond 2020? And very clearly, the nuclear side of the story doesn't want another target, but also more the fossil lobby, which is strong, is also promoting only a greenhouse gas target and not a renewable target anymore. So it's really that vested interest that is at play. Another example, Spain, where the government was having a huge investment in solar, a huge increase. Then the Euro crisis came, conservative government, and the coal industry, which is very much tied to the conservative government, strapped all those subsidies. And now you see that in Spain it's turning around again. So you see, really, we shouldn't be underestimating that power struggle that's happening.
Senator Murphy, how do you see the power struggle in the U.S.?
Well, I think it depends in part on what you mean by innovation in that question, right? We've seen tremendous innovation in the United States, but it's just innovation regarding how we get existing fossil fuels. We've seen, obviously, a revolution in the United States with our ability to get tight oil and gas coming from shale deposits, but that in part has been a disincentive to try to invest in true renewables, because we've already seen a pretty dramatic lowering of the price, at least with respect to industrial prices in the energy market. I think in the United States it would be pretty clear that we would agree with the audience that it's the acknowledgement that the planet is warming due to human contribution is the primary barrier to any new policy. We haven't done an energy bill in the United States Congress in 10 years, and the reason for that is pretty simple. We have a growing segment of the House of Representatives in the United States Senate that simply doesn't believe that global temperature changes have anything to do with man-made contributions. And in a country that consumes 25% of the world's energy, with only 5% of the world's population. The rest of us realize that true innovation only comes when the United States makes a decision to move towards renewables rather than simply cleaning fossil fuels in a different way. The secret of this new gas revolution is that, well, as long as you contain leakage, it is more environmentally friendly than coal. All you need is a 1% increase in the amount of methane that escapes from the capture process such that it is no longer any better for greenhouse gas emissions than coal. So in the United States, it really is a political barrier right now to innovation that goes beyond just a change in the way that we take oil and gas from the ground.
Is the, actually, Lawrence, before I go to you, Bas, is the issue of climate change and whether or not it has man-made causes part of a challenge or opposition force in the European Parliament?
I think the majority in the European Parliament is acknowledging climate change, but during an economic crisis, you see it's tumbling off the political agenda, so it's not a priority anymore. So I don't think in Europe there's only, on the extreme right of the Parliament, there you deny climate change, but within the European Parliament, everyone still reckons there is climate change. But what you hear now more is like, yes, but due to the economic crisis, we have to slow down. So it's less of a priority. But denying climate change is less popular in the European Parliament than it is in the Senate, I would say.
Again, Lawrence, just hang on, because you're going to have something to say about this too, I know. But Senator, when you encounter somebody, because I know many people in many parts of the world find it incomprehensible that there are members of the United States Senate and House who are reluctant to admit to climate change and the severity of it. When you encounter them, what do you say?
Well, if I had something particularly useful to say, we wouldn't have this problem in the United States, because I have not been persuasive. I mean, clearly you point them to the science in which those people that deny climate change are siding with less than 1% of peer-reviewed science. But I'll say this, I think in the United States, the people who deny the existence of man-made effects of climate change, it's really a proxy for an inherent distrust of government. They simply don't want the government to have anything to do with regulating the energy marketplace, and they think that ultimately the government will just screw it up. And instead of making that argument, they tend to just start a little bit earlier and say there's no need for the government to step in here because the condition of which you're trying to change doesn't exist in the first place. And so I think it's a mixture of folks who are just reading the wrong science, and maybe we can partially correct for that, but it also is tied in with this deep distrust that the government can actually fix the problem, even if it were to exist.
Lawrence Jones, let me get your response to all of that and to what the main challenges for you and your position are.
So first, let me start by what Senator Murphy said. So I would say that for those folks, they should actually embrace renewable energy because of decentralization. So if you're against centralized government, you should be for distributed generation, right? So that's maybe one message to convey to them. I think in the broader context, what this discussion, for me, what it points to is this whole issue of access, right? For me, when you talk about change, and we've talked about the US, we've talked about Europe, we've talked about Latin America, you put it in an Africa context, right, which is the other continent in this Atlantic Basin, I think the fundamental issue that has to change is not just the perception of how we go about producing energy. We also need to change the narrative in terms of how do we, as energy consumers, what it is that we want. The business models around energy has to change. All right, and in that respect, the issue of affordability becomes very critical. And so one of the things I would always say when we talk about this issue of affordability and accessibility, which I think are critical, and change in the same vein, what needs to happen is that, for example, if the Atlantic Basin states would like for Africa to consume less hydrocarbons, for example, but they have the clean technology, being solar, well, we need to come up with a paradigm that allows this sort of a technology transfer. Because what's happening today, a lot of African countries might want, and I say might because I'm not sure, might want to embrace clean technology, but they just cannot afford it or they do not have access to it. So I think one of the first things to address is accessibility of the technology and then making that technology easily accessible for the consumers. So part of this whole change process that has to happen in the context of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, but just the broader Atlantic Basin, is we have to look at the business models around how we go about making the technology accessible for the countries as well as the business models making the energy accessible for the consumers. And there I agree with you that that's where you look at distributed generation and other kinds of decentralized approaches. The last point I will make is, as much as I'm a strong proponent of renewables and other forms of clean technology, the reality is a lot of utilities around the world have made significant investments in existing power plants, right? So there needs to be a strategy where stranded costs, and Senator, I know this is something we discuss a lot in the States, stranded costs doesn't become an issue. Well, in the case of Africa, we don't have a lot of stranded cost issues here already, right? But what's happening is we're still going in Africa in the same direction of putting in place the same energy system that the United States and Europe is moving away from. And so the paradigm shift that has to happen is that African governments, African utilities have to step back and say, maybe we shouldn't follow the same steps that Europe and America took in terms of providing access. Let's look at decentralized energy as a strategy. For one reason, because a lot of Africa's population still live in rural areas. And we probably would want them to remain there because of the agricultural and food security issues, so that they don't have to depopulate those areas and create even larger urban communities.
You had a question that you asked. I believe it was some corporate heads about if the entire electrical grid, say, were wiped off the map. Continue that thought.
So a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to pose a question to a number of utility executives around the world. And the question I posed was, let's assume tomorrow morning we wake up and there's been a significant earthquake on the West Coast, huge tsunamis in parts of the East Coast. I mean, the entire energy system in Europe and America and Latin America has been decimated. And the question was, how do we rebuild from scratch, given the technology we have today? And what was surprising was the answer I got was that almost everyone went back to, we need to have base load generation. We need to build centralized power station. So this mind shift that is necessary, even in a situation where we've destroyed the entire infrastructure, everybody wants to go back to the way we had it before. So I think the thing that has to happen here is not so much of the technology. We have technology that we can bring to bear. It's the mindset, because everyone is so fixated on centralized power, which is not a bad thing. But we need to have a hybrid solutions where in certain instances, let's go decentralized. In other instances, let's look at centralized in a much more organized fashion.
Cesar Zamora, how did you approach that idea? Because is there not, I mean, Nicaragua basically leapfrogged ahead of other countries in terms of renewable and wind energy. Is there not a need for these baseload capabilities?
I believe that poverty fuels climate change. I think the best way to confront climate change is to bring citizens the capacity to have access to electricity. If they have access to electricity, the life of these people completely change.
How does that work in a place like Nicaragua, which is extremely poor? Can you give us an example?
It's a combination of foreign cooperation, World Bank aid, Inter-American Development Bank, European aid. Government has to be honest about it, and private sector have to push for honesty on delivering effectively these items to the society. It have been done in Nicaragua. We have been 40 years of having 5 out of 10 having electricity in Nicaragua now. In the last 6 years, I'm not a member of government, but they have worked to reduce that to 7 people out of 10 now in Nicaragua have electricity. And it's a formula very simple. Help from the United States, European countries, government that works effectively, and private sector who runs the sector. That's the way to go.
Okay, before we turn to the audience, any other comments up here in response to that? One of the wonderful things, if you look at your AD Connect technology, is you can see by region where people here are participating are from, going from A to Z, Angola to Zimbabwe. In between, Poland, Nicaragua, Portugal, many other places. And online, we're live streaming this, as you probably know. Brazil, I think, has the highest number of people who've clicked in to watch the live streaming so far, with well over 1,000 in aggregate last time I checked. You're representing many different points of view, many different populations. We would love to hear from those of you who've had experience in this area, be it successful experiences in terms of innovation, specific experiences maybe the rest of us don't know about. Those of you who are innovators among us, including some of the young leaders, if you can tell us about some of your ideas, what's gone right, what's gone wrong. And also, if anybody can talk about right now renewables versus the need for base load capacities, for something that will be there for when the sun doesn't shine, when the wind doesn't blow, for whatever it happens to be. We have a question right down here, and if you can keep your questions so short that everybody will be amazed at your brevity, and tell us who you are.
Andreas Kremer, Ecologic Institute in Berlin, Germany. One thing is, in Germany we regard renewables as baseload because they go into the market first and everything else is shifted in the merit curve, so everything else is less baseload than renewables. We're changing the game here, really. But my question to you is, those CEOs having really the old blueprint in their mind, obviously we cannot make the shift with them at the helm of the big utilities. They need to die, the companies need to die, and those CEOs need to go for the room. Who are the innovators and who are the new entrepreneurs? Who are the future customers of your company? Who do you work with under those circumstances?
You want me to answer that?
Oh, Lauren, sure.
So first of all, I don't like people dying, so I don't agree that they should die. I think, and to be honest, that's part of the discussion, that's part of the issue we have in this industry. People are putting people against each other. It's not the matter of them dying away. The utilities are transforming by a natural process. For example, in North America, where distributed generation is really taking off, we're seeing a lot of US utilities changing their business models just because of the impact of distributed generation. So their business models will change. You can ask yourself the question, what is the utility of the future going to look like? Maybe the very same utilities we have today will still exist, but their business models will change. So for example, in California, a utility could decide if the regulators, and that's something else we can discuss, if the regulators would allow them to do that, utilities could decide to maybe lease your rooftop and get in the business of selling solar. Right? But for that to happen, the regulatory model has to allow the utilities to become sellers of not just electricity, but also sellers of other kinds of services. So I agree with you that change has to happen, and for the record, those utilities that I talked about, most of them are very progressive in terms of what they're doing now in parts of the US and Europe as well as in in Latin America. So I hope the question is not for them to go away, it's for their business models to change. But the key point there, and we can come back to it, and I'd like to hear Senator Murphy's perspective on that, is that the regulatory model has to change to accommodate the kinds of changes that has to happen in these systems.
I would just wholeheartedly agree. I think to the extent that other countries are building power systems based on the American model, American utilities are not getting smaller, they are getting bigger. Despite the evidence that suggests that the prices and the service to consumers are not any better the bigger these places get. We've got a wonderful example in Connecticut. We have a system in which we are largely governed by a regional utility that just got a lot bigger through a consolidation between two states, and we have some small municipal-owned power companies. Well, almost without exception, those very small municipal-owned power companies that are maybe only generating for 20 or 30,000 households are delivering electricity at a lower price, and when we have these outages, which we have in the Northeast fairly frequently, getting power back on much quicker. And yet we have a regulatory process that is all too willing to expand the size of the big utilities and makes it pretty hard for these small utilities without the huge regulatory and government relations back office to be able to survive. And so if the United States wants to set an example for the rest of the world, we have to change our model to support some of these smaller distributors.
We have another question. Actually, hold on, sir. I think someone in the front has the mic. Yep. Yes.
Yeah. My name is Marcos Freitas from Brazil. On Monday, Britain announced that they were going to have a new nuclear power plant. Now, my question is this, and the argument was energy security. That was one of the major arguments vented by the government. Can renewables provide energy security? That's question number one. And the question number two that I had is how's many of the African countries, according to what we said, what we read, are producing, not ethanol, but ethanol is Brazil, but are producing oil. How are they dealing with the resource curse, which could be a major problem for them in the future?
Who wants to take that?
Well, shall I start with the renewable and energy security?
Sure.
Interestingly enough, of course, the UK claiming to then become more energy secure, I mean, in the end, you have to import uranium to a large extent, so that means you're still not energy secure. And secondly, if you look at the knowledge on nuclear, it's hardly in the UK, so at least they have to have a lot of French information into it, and maybe in this audience it's all the same, but for the UK and France, historically they always have some difficult relations, but you see now that the UK is totally dependent on French knowledge there. So if you look at renewables, it's very clearly, it will help, especially a continent like Europe, but also Africa, to become more energy independent. And I think especially for Europe, which is totally dependent of imports of oil and gas now, I think renewables is the best way to become more energy independent. And I think the same goes for Africa. I think in the US you see now a different discussion with the shale gas, that energy independence suddenly changes the agenda towards shale gas, which is of course, well, another debate we are going in. But in the end, yeah, renewables are helpful there to get to energy independency.
The only point I would add is there are many ways to make renewable perform like base load. And if we're talking about innovation and thinking 5, 10 years from now, even 20 years from now, I'm a strong believer that energy storage, we're going to break the threshold for energy storage becoming very, very effective. And with energy storage combined with renewables, whether it's solar or wind, I think you have a very good combination of what could be considered a base load for a community or base load for homes. So I think we should not make these kinds of comparisons. Can renewable be base load? Because renewable plus storage is a perfect match of what could be base load. In terms of consumption, just look at Denmark. One of the reasons the Danes have been very successful in integrating a lot of renewables because they can always rely on the significant amount of storage they get from the Norwegian system as well as the neighbors. So I think combined with storage, renewable can perform extremely well. And the point you made about Africa, I think, we've heard this thing about the resource curse for a long time. I think we need to be very, very careful when we look at how we go about bringing electricity to most of sub-Saharan Africa. In spite of having a lot of natural resource, there is still huge energy poverty in most parts of Africa. So what I would suggest is, if you want to export oil or export other hydrocarbons, do that, but then take the resources you get and buy renewables. Right? So you're going to export it because that's where you're exporting. But instead of using that money to build centralized power stations throughout Africa, why not use that money and support renewable integration or renewable technology on the continent?
I have a question for those out there who may be listening over the internet who may not be as entrenched in this issue as all of you are, and many people in the audience as well. When you talk about renewables, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about a broad portfolio of geothermal, wind, solar, biomass. I mean, really the broad portfolio.
And geographically, does that definition differ at all, depending on where you are?
No.
Not so much? Second question. I hear different responses to this, but is solar storable? Solar energy?
What do you mean by is it storable?
Can you store it?
Well, I mean, yeah, you could store it if you had the right storage mechanism, yes. You can store it just as you can store wind. If you had a right, a well-designed storage device, you should be able to store any form of energy.
But I think it's extraordinarily expensive, is it not? The technology for that? I mean, because this is
all
an issue.
All I would say to you, Lisa, on that issue is that let's look at how PV prices is going down significantly around the world.
Photovoltaic prices.
Photovoltaic prices, right? So, I'm sure Senator Murphy from his state, they've seen the same thing. The price of renewable is going down significantly, right? Yeah. And I think one of the messages I would like us to get away from in terms of this discussion for renewable is that it's very expensive. Because it depends on what context. In parts of the US, renewable actually can be cost competitive depending on the energy mix you have. So it depends on where you're producing your energy and the energy mix in general.
Sure, but in terms of reliability, if one is to know at what cost we can count on reliable energy, I think that's the point in terms of the solar, whether or not it could be something that is relied on long-term regardless of the amount of sun one gets. Just looking for kind of a simple answer on that.
Simple answer is you can make it reliable. It all depends on the operational paradigm in which you find yourself. We've seen it in the States that you can do it. It's happening in Denmark. You can make it reliable. It's not a simple yes answer, but you can make it reliable.
And of course, the ability to store solar also ultimately makes it much more attractive as a resource used by individuals, because individuals are going to be much more likely to put a whole mess of solar panels in their backyard or up on their house if then they can store that energy, use it at the moment when prices are highest on the grid, or sell it back if there is a methodology in which that they can make money of it on variable pricing. So as we try to envision a system in the United States in which we are encouraging more and more individuals to either put up turbines in their backyard or solar panels on their roof, it's the battery storage capacity that ultimately will really transform our country such that we have millions and millions of little power plants all over the country feeding into the grid at the right time and holding it at the right time.
And how far away is the U.S. from that, and is it happening elsewhere?
I don't know whether it's happening elsewhere, but right now, our focus is just on trying to get as many panels as we can on people's houses, never mind try to deal with a slightly more complex issue of personal storage.
Cesar?
And I believe there is no a copy and paste formula for to solve the capacity problem of each country. I think we have to be wise enough in finding what each country has their weakness and their strengths. And you have to find what is in the long term you are available to do with, like in Nicaragua, with the help of international organizations, business community. We have to involve local universities, engineering universities in finding the technology that is appropriate according to the resources that we have. And if we are honest, we will find the possibility of solving the needs of each country. But there is no recipe that we can find today that can copy and multiply. Each country has to have a dialogue in trying to solve their energy solutions.
Thank you. I want to remind the audience, by the way, that there is a Q&A application on your AD Connect device where you can ask a question and it will appear. And I'm told you can ask it anonymously, for better or worse, and it will appear up here. But right now we have some more questions in the audience. Nick?
Nick Gowing. Let me just add one point to that point about the British nuclear order. The significant minority shareholding in the new order will be from China, because they were the only people who were prepared to take the risk within the bounds laid by the British government. But let me come on to the point I wanted to ask you about. What is the reality of politics, particularly in the United States, and how is it changing because of fracking, but also other issues? And I say that for this reason. I've had conversations with a number of utility and extractive industries and the big corporates who say, look, things have changed dramatically. The emissions level within the United States is now down to 1994 levels. Right. And therefore, the politics of this have changed dramatically. Because I think, Senator, you used the word fix. There's a kind of self-fixing which is going on at many state levels and in the way people are consuming power now. And therefore, the pressure, either at the federal level or on the state level, on the business of sustainability has changed quite significantly, and therefore changed significantly the political framework within which all this is happening. Could you help us understand that? And do you actually accept that emissions are down to the 1994 level, which sounds quite extraordinary?
It is extraordinary, but if you take a look at what the projections are for the next 5 to 10 years, it's actually rather pedestrian in terms of what our future emissions level decreases are going to be, only in around the 5% range, which if you look at what we need to be as a nation in order to make a significant contribution ultimately to the fight against global warming, is catastrophic. The United States needs to be doing much more than 5% over the next decade. And again, the reason for that is that we have just had a disincentive since 2008, when we've substantially invested in fracking for renewable energy technology. The politics of this right now are fairly non-controversial. There is fairly large bipartisan support for fracking. I think that will change as we move into deposits that are slightly more risky. That will change the minute there is a large-scale contamination of a public drinking supply, a public water drinking supply. But today, there is fairly broad bipartisan support. We have an interesting conversation that we're about to have with respect to whether we are going to start to do significant exports. And it'll be interesting as well to see if that lines up along political lines as well. It will essentially be a conversation about whether we want to be energy secure and hold on to our gas resources, or whether we want to do something about a price which has been artificially low by continuing to export. And that will probably be the most important political argument we will have, because right now, there is not significant political opposition in the United States Congress on the technology. The political controversy will probably lie around whether we're going to hold it for ourselves or sell it through LNG terminals to the rest of the world.
Let me just refer to one of our questions here, asked by Paul Isbell. It's the middle question there. Paul, I believe, is the person who wrote the report that I was quoting from the German Marshall Fund. How should Atlantic societies pursuing renewable energy sources deal with the implications of the shale revolution and the hydrocarbons boom in the Atlantic Basin? I don't know if, Senator, you want to weigh in on that more, but if we have anything else from the panel.
Well, I'll just add this, which is that as the chairman of the Europe Subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee, every week, I'll have a handful of meetings with visiting parliamentarians from Europe, and almost in every meeting, one of the questions that comes up is, when can we expect to see these exports come? And I think one of the interesting conversations that will happen across the basin is whether Europe is going to make a decision to pursue shale as well. I think that there is a risk that if the United States chooses to export in large quantities, then it will allow Europe to sort of sit back and say, you know what, the political dialogue for them is a little bit trickier than it is for us around the potential environmental consequences of shale gas exploration. And I think one of the interesting cross-Atlantic conversations is going to be, is this going to be purely an American endeavor, or are the Europeans really going to step up and pursue what could be substantial shale deposits and confront some of the political issues surrounding that? I think from our perspective, although there is some attraction to the U.S. having a monopoly across the Atlantic Basin on production, if we are able to sell into Europe, in the long run, it's really not in our interest to be the only economy that is drilling below our land for this resource.
Is that true?
I think ultimately we are then, I think we will eventually confront areas of shale that are too dangerous to go after. And as we have seen with oil and deep water drilling, to the extent that we don't have other places to go, there's going to be a temptation to eventually expand shale exploration into places and areas where there will be potential consequences to environmental quality.
Bas Eickhout, speak for your continent.
Yeah. Well, there are some differences between the US and Europe. First, one of them is that in Europe we're very good in talking before we decide on something, and that's sometimes a problem, but I think in the shale gas discussion that might not be a problem, because we are discussing this for such a long time that maybe the shale gas boom in the US is on its way back already before we will get to a decision. So sometimes that's helpful. Secondly, what's also different is that in the US it's the people who own the land, so also what's in the land or under the land, whereas in Europe it's the government who's owning that. So also there you have a different way how the play will go. But thirdly, and I think that's important to also to the question what the Atlantic Society should do, I think in Europe what the biggest problem now is that the cheap coal from the US, because of the shale gas, therefore the price of the coal in the US is going down, and the coal export is now flooding the European market, which leads to gas-fired power plants who are standing still, because it's cheaper to let your coal-fired power plant run instead of your gas-fired power plants. And I think one of the most important issues is, of course, putting the right price on carbon. The price mechanisms at this stage are not functioning. In Europe it's not, but all over the world we don't have the right price for carbon. And I think if we are working on that, if we strip away fossil subsidies, which are around the globe substantially, I think that should be a very important tool, a political tool that we should go into in order to get the balance a bit more right. And I think, talking for Europe, shale gas It will never take off at such a rate as in the US, and you see also country-specific developments, of course. In France, there's a moratorium. In the Netherlands, they backed out of it. In the UK, there's still a heavy debate on it. And in Poland, which is probably the country which is most active on it, but that's mainly because they see that if they got away from coal and don't want to become dependent of Russia, then maybe shale gas might be it. But like I said, the debate will probably take so long that I think we will go into other solutions in the end.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Adama Gaya from Senegal, from Africa. When we talk about renewable, it's a bit far-fetched for us Africans. We may be more interested in hearing from the panel what should be done for Africa to benefit from the huge resources that are being discovered and making Africa today the new frontier for energy. And of course, in the past, we have had opportunities to dealing with Western nations located in Atlantic. But unfortunately, whether during the Cold War, during colonial times, or during the proxy and internal conflict that occurred in Africa, those resources were not exploited. It's after the Cold War, when these Western Atlantic nations left the continent, that new players, especially China, came in and we started discovering that indeed on the ground, we have those resources in Africa. So the question in my mind is for Africa, even before going to renewable, even if we have enough of natural resources on this front, what can be done in terms of transfer of technology, in terms of facilitating innovation, in terms of investing into those resources and helping drilling in Africa. And unfortunately, the major companies, like the big oil companies, are running away, shying away from taking these responsibilities. We have small companies, wildcatters coming in. Unfortunately, what could be done in this regard before we talk of renewable energies? I think.
Lawrence?
So there's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
Let me just say a few things. I think first of all, let's step back and say to ourselves, the fact that you find you have a lot of natural resource in Africa, oil and other hydrocarbons, that doesn't necessarily mean you should not invest in renewables. The point is this, right? We've known of Africa's enormous resource in terms of hydrocarbons for a long time. What concerns me, Lisa, is the fact that in spite of all of these resources, you still have almost 500 million people in Africa with access to electricity. So the point that's important for me is, yes, we can discuss the resource technology transfer. Policymakers, governments, need to step back and come up with a strategy to say, look, how are we going to electrify and provide energy services for 500 million Africans? There is no one-size-fits-all. But I would argue that given the huge amounts of God-given sun that exists in Africa, hydro resources, why not explore those resources and exploit them better? Today, you got people in the rural communities who, if you were to build a centralized power station, you need a grid to connect them to that centralized power station. Well, if you did that leapfrogging that Cesar talked about and went into those areas and brought energy access to those people, my concern as we go out into the future, talk about 2030, a date everyone talks about. Well, in the next 16 years, how many Africans, in spite of all of the resource we have, will still have no access to electricity? That, my friend, should be the concern of the policymakers as well as the investors, because all of the young people, there was a discussion yesterday about the youth population and education. There has to be a way to get those people to become part of the society. And centralized power might be one solution, but I can tell you that decentralized power, based on renewables, based on solar, would get a lot of entrepreneurs and others to become part of the society. So your question has a lot of parts to it, but I just want to say that there's no one size what can be done to bring technology, because technology is not the issue. The issue is good governance. The issue is the regulatory framework. The issue is financing, right? These are not issues that the Western countries or the private sector alone can do. The African governments need to wake up to the reality that you have renewables, you have solar. Don't always go for the big centralized power station because it's probably the easiest thing to do. So I hope I've given you some thoughts in terms of how we approach this. But again, at the end of the day, you have 500 million Africans who don't have access to electricity as we speak. Doesn't matter how much shale gas you have in Africa, how much natural gas, unless you give those people electricity, this discussion is, from my perspective, is mute.
Lawrence, I want to have you keep the floor just for another minute, because you can talk a little bit about the other hat that you wear in your life in terms of investing in education and training. And this is where the word that Bas so rudely stole from you, future, comes into play, because you're saying that as Africa is going to move toward a certain goal, the goal has to be defined and the people have to be properly trained. You're doing that.
Absolutely. So one of the things, for full disclosure, I was born in Liberia, lived in Sweden, and now I live in America. So I've seen these Atlantic Basin trends in terms of what is going on. And as I look at the energy sector, what we need in Africa has to be, how do you create the workforce to be able to deal with these things? You build a power station in Africa today. Who's going to maintain it 10 years from now? A lot of the big power projects going on in Africa is not being built by Africans. But if you don't build the human capacity, if you don't educate these young people, what is going to happen? So one of the things I've done as a way of trying to give back to the continent, we started a nonprofit called the Center for Sustainable Development in Africa. The whole focus of that thing is to get young people in Africa to focus on energy. But I would argue, Senator Murphy, that we need this discussion in the entire Atlantic Basin, because for some reason, engineering is no longer attractive. So America has issues with getting more people into engineering. Europe has issues with getting people into engineering, and so does Latin America. So it's an Atlantic Basin issue. How do we get more people into engineering, into energy, to be able to sustain these technologies after we've built them?
Is Marco Gazzino in the audience from NL? Is he? He was here earlier. If anyone runs into him, he has some very interesting things to talk about in terms of what's happening through his company based in Italy in terms of innovation. Before we have time for probably one or two more questions, give me some ideas of what other innovations are working in your region. Can anybody kind of give us something that either you know of that's working or that you think should work, that has potential? Yes. Let's get the microphone to you.
Thank you. I'm Johanna Mendelson-Foreman. I have a project, I'm on a board of a company called EarthSpark and SparkMeter in Haiti. And one of the things that we've been doing in the western claw of Haiti is micro-hydro grids, which combine both the use of the small waterways, but also you carry some base load with a very small diesel engine. And that started as a small project, has now been funded by Deutsche Bank and the Clinton Global Initiative. But what it promises is a model for many rural communities where you are not ever going to invest in large grids, but are you going to be able to give many households a successful opportunity to have some energy. And also SparkMeter, which is doing the calibration of energy used, is also a way of preventing fraud and stealing energy, because it is a prepaid energy system that people can use like paying their cell phone. So I think this is a very promising technology. It now is taken off. It's been in existence 5 years and can go throughout the Caribbean and throughout Africa.
Thank you. A question here?
My question was going to be about getting the panel to get back to Africa, but that's already happened thanks to your intervention. So instead I'll pick up on your question, Lisa, an example of what works. Let's not forget that out of the 4 continents around the Atlantic Basin, the one that depends the most on renewable energy is actually Africa, but it is the form of biomass. It's wood fuels and it's charcoal. And examples of what can be done in Africa using African technologies and African entrepreneurship are abundant. I'll just give you one example, a company called Clean Star Mozambique, which won the delightfully named Screw Business as Usual prize from Richard Branson. Very briefly, what that company does is, at one end of the chain, you have thousands of farmers using agroforestry systems to increase their productivity and to generate surplus cassava, which gets turned into ethanol, which gets turned into a cooking fuel, which gets sold to lower and middle income women in Maputo. Why do the women buy it? Not because it's good for the planet or it's good for their health, but because it's a fast cooking solution which is cheap and which is clean. The reason why it works is because this company is a for-profit company that did its market study. It is a company that wanted to do good, that wanted to get Africans away from deforestation and from the damaging health effects of charcoal. But instead of coming out with a project, it came out with a business plan. And that is where the salvation of Africa's energy challenge is going to lie. I agree with you. Renewables is the future of Africa. Thank you.
I would love to hear more ideas. We're running out of time. I just have a couple more quick questions and we'll finish up. Senator Murphy, let me ask you, you well know that next month the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is going to be held in Warsaw. Are you going to that by any chance?
I'm not, but I'll have staff who will be there.
But what?
I'll have staff who will be there.
Your staff will be there.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of U.S. presence is going to be at international climate change conferences. In the past, the U.S. has not taken a leadership role. With the changes that are going on right now in energy technologies, is the United States feeling even less inclined to take a leadership role on this issue?
No, not at all. We have a president who is absolutely committed to putting the United States back in a leadership role with respect to global climate change talks. A president who didn't wait for the United States Congress to deliver on an energy bill, put forward his own climate action plan that is very aggressive, proposes the regulation of not only new power plant sources, effectively stopping the building of new coal plants, but also regulating existing power plant sources, very controversial thing in the United States. But he's nominated a Secretary of State who, of course, has spent his whole life traveling the world representing the United States in international climate talks. That's John Kerry. John Kerry wouldn't take that position if he wasn't planning for the United States to be a leader. I will just say this, the world can't wait for an agreement in 2015 to be operative in 2020, which is why we are also helping to lead some of these very important agreements, whether they be multilateral or bilateral agreements on non-CO2 sources. You talk about soot as one of those sources, but methane and the work that we're doing with China and hopefully as we move forward with India on HFCs are equally important. If you can have some short-term agreements led in part by the work of Secretary Kerry with China, India, several other developing nations on transitioning away from HFCs and having some best industry practices on landfills and gas and oil exploration to reduce methane leakage, you can make some pretty substantial progress in the lead up to an agreement in 2015 on carbon. The United States obviously is a chilling presence given a 97-0 vote against the Kyoto Protocols in the United States Senate. I will just tell you that today there is a very different United States Senate with a lot more champions than we may have had back then to support the efforts of the administration as we move forward in those talks.
Right, notwithstanding the climate change deniers.
Notwithstanding the deniers, they are still there, and it will make that agreement very, very difficult. You know, let me say this, the American public is waking up to this reality. The big megastorms of the Northeast certainly have changed the perspective of many. I would count myself skeptical that you will see massive political change in the United States Senate ready for a 2015 agreement. So it's still an uphill battle, but I think public opinion is trending in the right way.
Final comment from Lawrence. I'm looking at the lineage. The senator and others have talked about their children who are going to inherit this earth. You look at your dad, who was one of, I think you told me, 3 engineers, electrical engineers in Liberia, who helped to electrify such a large swath of the country. That was torn down in the Civil War. Is that one of the reasons why you're feeling right now so passionately about restoring electricity to the country?
Yeah,
and to the continent?
Absolutely. I think for me, it's for me, my dad, 2 days before he died, looked at me and said, whatever you do, don't forget Liberia and don't forget Africa in terms of electricity. His whole life was about electricity. So for me, it's a personal deadbed's wish from my father to sort of carry on this torch, if you may, whether I'm in the States or in Europe, wherever. But I think what's very important, Lisa, is listening to Senator Murphy and others here, is we have a generation of young people coming behind us who need to be prepared for a world where seawater rise will become the normal thing. It doesn't have to be that way if we act now. And I know a lot of people want to put off and say, well, I won't be around in the next 20 years. Well, if my dad had said the same thing, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. So I think now is the time for us to come together and say, look, 20 years from now, we want the world to be a better place for Senator Murphy's kids, for my kids, for your kids, which means maybe we should change our mindset and invest in renewables, not because it necessarily makes a lot of money today. We need to get away from having profit to drive our thinking, because the planet, there's no price to pay on the planet, right? So we need to invest now for the future, and we may not be around for that future, but our children will be around.
Thank you. Dr. Lawrence Jones. We also have on the left Honorable Bas Eickhout, member of the European Parliament. Thank you also to Senator Chris Murphy and also to Cesar Zamora. And thank you all for participating, and please keep the conversation going.
And thank you, Lisa. That was great. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Now we're going to take a break. Be back at 5:30 for our next session, which focuses on trade. Thank you.